will take forward.
Before we come to First Minister's questions, I am sure Ministers would wish to join me in welcoming to the gallery the Deputy Chairman and members from the Consultative Assembly of Oman. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Well, I'm sure the whole Chamber will want to join me in sending our warmest congratulations to Pope Francis on his election, the first ever Pope from Latin America. His election will be a great encouragement to our Catholic community, who are such an important and highly valued part of the fabric of Scotland. The Pope's first message, urging greater bonds of understanding between peoples and nations, is one that will resonate around the world, and we wish the Church well under the new leadership of Pope Francis. Later today, I'll have meetings to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
Thank you. And of course, I join with the First Minister in welcoming the new Pope and wish him every good wish in the times ahead, and we recognise particular importance this is to the Catholic community within Scotland. Last week, a document the First Minister didn't want the people of Scotland to see revealed that what he and his ministers say in private is different from what they say in public. It was revealed that his Finance Minister and his Chief Economic Advisor think that forecasting oil revenues is so difficult that John Swinney privately questions the affordability of pensions. John Swinney's private words hold the First Minister's public position below the waterline. So, after a feverish weekend and a hastily arranged press conference, the First Minister declares from nowhere an oil boom. Does the First Minister not think we can see the join?
First Minister.
I'm glad that Joanne Lamont thinks that the powers of the Scottish Government are such to present the detailed oil and gas outlook bulletin in the course of a weekend. Unfortunately for Joanne Lamont, she doesn't going to remember that 2 weeks ago, at this question time, I said the Scottish Government will shortly publish the first in a series of analytical bulletins on oil and gas. The new analysis demonstrates the vast potential that remains. Now, much as I would welcome the accolade that the Scottish Government are so efficient that we can produce such a serious, detailed analysis over the course of a weekend, I have to say the statement 2 weeks ago should have given people a clue, if they were listening, that the oil and gas bulletin was about to appear. But why don't we do it to the independent, impartial commentator Douglas Fraser of the BBC, who said on 12th of March, if, as his critics claim, it was conjured out of thin air as a response to last week's events, then some of the First Minister's team are not bad at magic.
Joanne Lamont.
Our problem is that we listen too often, but we never hear an answer to the serious questions, that his own document challenges us with. You say one thing in private, you say something else in public, and whatever you said on Monday doesn't address that problem. Monday's oil boom drowned the credibility of his Chief Economic Advisor, Crawford Beveridge, and his Finance Minister. So let's move on to another of his advisers, Professor John Kay. He says, and I quote, that Scotland should be ready to adopt an independent currency. Professor Kay also said a new currency would have to be done quickly, or people could move their money out of Scotland before it is launched. Does the First Minister agree with this adviser, or will he now rule out a separate Scotland having its own currency?
First Minister.
I think that in the first answer, from which we are quickly moving on, did we notice? Pointed out that 2 weeks ago I told this Chamber that the oil and gas bulletin was about to be published. And in the second question, I have to concede that Joanne Lamont doesn't seem to have read the report of the Fiscal Commission, assembled and over the course of a year with 2 Nobel laureates on the Fiscal Commission that explained exactly what the best policy for Scotland was in terms of the currency and our sterling area. That's what was published, I think, 4 or 5 weeks ago. So I've got to conclude that not only does Joanne Lamont not listen to what I say in First Minister's questions, that she doesn't bother to read the report of the Fiscal Commission, which is exactly why we commissioned that serious piece of work. So that puts forward the Government's policy, does so in a serious and comprehensive way. Can I say to Joanne Lamont that the difficulty that she has with this is trying to give the impression or the argument that somehow, uniquely among the countries of the world, that this nation of Scotland, with its immense natural and human resources, is somehow incapable of running its economy and society rather better than the disaster which is emanating from Westminster.
Joanne Lamont.
It says quite a lot about what the First Minister thinks an answer to a question is if he imagines that that even began to respond to the question I asked him. We're not arguing about Scotland's resources. We are arguing about the First Minister's risk-rich, assertion-rich, fantasy-rich plans for our country. But I do note that he hasn't ruled out the question of a separate Scottish currency, and it was something that he used to want. Then he wanted the euro. Now the line is, we will keep sterling. Professor Kay has made the point that any launch of a new currency would have to be made suddenly. Otherwise, wealth may flow out of Scotland before it is launched. It would be a gift for spiffs and speculators. And in a sense, then, perhaps it is something the First Minister couldn't commit to publicly. So can I ask him, has he had any private conversations about a separate Scottish currency with Professor Kay or anyone else?
First Minister.
I have had conversations with a range of people, including the Fiscal Commission, who come up with what they believe is the best policy for Scotland, which is the policy of this government and has been for some considerable time. Now, Joanne Lamont says that we have changed our policy over the years. Yes, I can remember someone called, what was his name again? He was Shadow Secretary of State for Scotland, Alistair Darling, in the Commons, telling people that not joining the euro would impose extraordinary costs on the economy. I can remember Tony Blair saying it was time to join the euro. I can even remember Kenneth Clarke arguing forward to the euro. I can remember all of these things. And therefore, I think Joanne Lamont is on shaky ground, suggesting that she would look for policy consistency over 20 years from the Labour Party, which has not been evident. Therefore, the policy put forward by the Scottish Government of being part of a sterling area, which we've debated many times, consolidated and put forward by the Fiscal Commission with its 2 Nobel laureates, seems to me a great deal more examination and presentation than has ever been managed by the Labour Party or its unionist friends in Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
Despite the touch of amateur dramatics about that, he still didn't answer the question. Now, and I have to say, we know that Alex Salmond is known for his insults, but the problem is, this is worse, he is insulting the intelligence of the people of Scotland. So let me get this right. In private, the First Minister and his colleagues question whether there will be a state pension, and in public, he can't tell pensioners.
Order.
They obviously still haven't read the document that was leaked to the rest of us. In private, the First Minister and his colleagues question whether there will be a state pension, and in public, he can't tell pensioners. In public, he can't tell pensioners what currency it would be paid in if it exists. The First Minister asserts. Order. The First Minister asserts we could keep sterling, but what would he do if the deal on offer from the Bank of England was unacceptable? What would he do if the fiscal constraints were too tight? What would he do if there were strings imposed by London? Would he go for a separate Scottish currency?
Order! Order! We will hear the member. Order! Ms Sturgeon.
No one else gets
It is astonishing that being asked serious questions, asking serious questions creates the degree of derision amongst the backbenchers, because of course, we know that they are never allowed to ask any of these questions to their own front bench. Even if, in their heart of hearts, they know that their own front bench are incapable of answering them. So, would the First Minister go for a separate Scottish currency or then join the euro? His own advisers say he would need a plan B, and we are entitled to know what it is.
Absolutely.
He must have one in private. It's time he made it public.
First Minister.
I think it's different with Joanne Lamont that she doesn't have a plan A, never mind a plan B. But the reason for the hilarity about the strings pulled from London, can I say just seriously to Joanne Lamont that I suspect the reason she voted for the Iraq war is because the strings were being pulled from London and the Labour Party. We are in favour of Scotland continuing in a sterling area, and we set out the reasons for that in the Fiscal Commission report, which by any estimation is a huge and serious piece of analysis. That's the third time I've answered Joanne Lamont's question. But the key point she makes, and the scaremongering attack, is about pensions. Can I point out two things to Joanne Lamont? One is that Scotland currently spends less on social protection as part of our total national product than the UK as a whole. In other words, we are better able to afford welfare than pensions in the UK at the present moment. Secondly, has she no awareness as what is happening to pensions in the United Kingdom? Private sector pensions, public sector pensions, which are being seriously jeopardised and undermined by the current administration. Has she no awareness of what's happening? And thirdly, and the key point of all of this, is what other country in the world would have a unionist coalition suggesting that the immense wealth to flow from Scotland's natural resources was somehow a handicap and a problem, instead of what every other country in the world sees it as an opportunity to combine our natural resources and human resources to be used in economically successful and prosperous Scotland.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. May I also associate myself and the Scottish Conservative Party with the First Minister's welcome to Pope Francis, and to ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Prime Minister.
First Minister.
No plans in the near future.
Ruth Davidson.
Presiding Officer, last week we heard in the Swinney Leaks document that the Finance Secretary accepted the OBR projections that North Sea oil revenue would halve in 5 years. The First Minister's response, although he denies that he moved up or rushed out in any way, was a fantasy report, barely 6 pages long, asserting a new oil boom in Scotland. The smoke and mirrors of this report was compounded by taking an average of 4 cherry-picked examples and conveniently leaving the OBR's respected projection to one side. The First Minister mentioned just a few moments ago his own fiscal commission with its 2 Nobel laureates on it. Well, that same commission warned that the Scottish Government should plan budgets on a cautious estimate for oil revenues. So can the First Minister tell us why, against his own experts' advice, against his own Finance Secretary's acknowledgement, he has ignored the, and I quote, unchallenged, independent, more cautious estimate?
First Minister.
Well, we haven't. I'm sorry Ruth Davidson didn't just accept what Joanne Lamont refused to accept, that the Oil and Gas Bulletin had been in preparation for some considerable time, as the evidence indicates. She claims that we put forward an ambitious estimate for oil prices. That is simply not the case. We've assumed a declining real-term oil price over the term of the forecast, $113 in nominal terms, declining in real terms. And incidentally, if you take an average of DEC, the US, the Economic Intelligence Unit, the Item Club, NIESR and the OBR, then you come to a figure exactly that in 2017 and 2018. I think by any reasonable estimation, and I've got a range of quotes of people who make reasonable estimations here, Professor John McLaren, for example, the Scottish Government's Oil and Gas Analytical Bulletin is a very welcome addition to the statistical landscape, especially with the referendum approaching. If any reasonable estimation of the analysis within that Oil and Gas Statistical Bulletin, then I think it received a very strong welcome indeed for those who don't have the sort of vested interest as the Conservative Party. And can I just point out to Ruth Davidson, the point I tried to make to her last week about the industry estimates. In the OBR estimates, they assume oil production will decline to 1.5 million barrels a day and keep going down, actually. The industry, the people who are investing the money, the 11 billion this year, the 13 billion coming in the course of this financial year, they say that production, as a result of these billions being spent, is going to go to 2 million barrels a day. So isn't it kind of reasonable to follow the people who are investing the money as opposed to the OBR, who incidentally didn't publish 6 pages on their oil forecasts, but didn't publish any pages at all?
Ruth Davidson.
The First Minister's £48 billion from 2017-18 only takes in the 4 projections that the Scottish Government put out and leaves off the OBR particularly. But let's look at those projections, because we asked the Scottish Parliament to ask the Scottish Government if we could see the sums behind this document. And this is what the Scottish Government had to say. The scale and complexity of the models we use, combined with the fact that some of them rely on firm-level data and subscriptions to commercial data sources, means that we are not in a position to make them publicly available. So, in other words, we made these projections up and we're not telling you how. It's too big, it's too complicated to let this Parliament or let the people of Scotland know. Just take us on trust. Well, First Minister, after the European legal advice fiasco, we know exactly how far to trust this Scottish Government. By ignoring the OBR, by fiddling the figures, isn't it true that this First Minister is asking Scotland to take a massive punt with a dodgy bookie who's fixing the race?
First Minister.
I say we didn't have any further conversation about relying on the industry estimates of what happens if you invest £100 billion, as they intend to do, on increasing. Now, what does she think the industry is investing that money? Are they investing it to reduce oil and gas production? The reason they're investing it is to increase oil and gas production. So let's just assume and accept that the 2 million barrels a day by the industry is a better, more reliable guide than in terms of production than the OBR our estimate of estimating falling production. Let's just say that is reasonably solid information. And the other point she makes, and she made the point again, she claimed that in assuming $113 we had excluded the OBR from an average price. DEC average, which is another department of the UK Government, incidentally, DEC estimate by 2017-18 $133. That's the mid-term estimate. The US Economic Agency, $112. The Economic Intelligence Unit, not known for forecasting high oil prices, $115. The NIESR, $114. And the OBR, $92. Now, the average of these estimates is $113. We did not exclude the OBR in terms of calculating an average, and no one seriously believes, assuming a declining real oil price over the next 5 to 6 years is somehow an ambitious and not a cautious estimate. I mean, if we take the OECD figures, for example, published just last week, they're talking about oil prices over $150. None of that was included in analysis because we were following the right line of assuming a reasonable production forecast and a cautious oil price forecast. But what we have to accept as opposed to the extraordinary remarks of Mr Rennie that I saw on television, suggesting that OBR has a good record in forecasting oil revenue. The OBR has an extraordinary bad record. They've never got a single forecast right in forecasting oil revenues, and if to believe sources of the Conservative Party, the OBR don't get anything else right in terms of forecasting. So let's accept it's a substantial contribution to the debate, has been widely welcomed by those who are interested in the debate, and suggests to the Scottish people that the natural resources of Scotland will be flowing from the North Sea for generations to come. The question is, having lost out in the last 40 years, let's make sure that Scotland gets its share from the next 40 years.
Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware that it has emerged this week that some 50 patients at Gartnavel Hospital had their surgery postponed because surgical instruments from the Central Decontamination Unit, based at Cowlairs in my constituency, were not safe for use. We are advised by press reports that consultants have been complaining about the standard of service received from the Decontamination Unit for years. Although the press reports identified a particular problem at Gartnavel, this decontamination unit serves all 120 of Greater Glasgow and Clyde's operating theatres. So can the First Minister advise the Chamber, when the Scottish Government were first made aware of the problem, what action it has taken to resolve it, and what checks have been undertaken across the board area to ensure the problem is not more widespread?
Can I thank Ferguson for her question, and I'll ask the Health Secretary to write to her about the exact detail. What I can tell her is that the information supplied by the Health Board shows that the particular issue was the breaking of the sealed packaging in terms of the equipment that was being delivered. And quite rightly and properly, the doctors concerned did not proceed with operations under these conditions. That is incidentally part of the patient safety guarantee within the health service in Scotland, which is now being so praised domestically and internationally. That is part of that charter of patient safety, that you don't proceed unless you're sure of the integrity of the equipment. I can also say that the patients concerned, the arrangements are being made to make sure they are all treated within the waiting time guarantee. And surely it's the right course when medical equipment is not has not got assurance of being properly sterilised for operations not to take place. The patients do not suffer in terms of their entitlement to the patient guarantee. But I shall certainly, because of the seriousness with which we take this issue, make sure that the Health Secretary gives the member a comprehensive reply for her constituents.
Question 3, Willie Rennie.
Can I join the First Minister in congratulating the new Pope? In this turbulent world, Pope Francis has a heavy burden, and I think everybody in this chamber will wish him well in his endeavours. To ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
Issues of importance to the people of Scotland.
The First Minister will have heard that the Prime Minister is proposing to act on press regulation next week. He has ended the cross-party talks and is tabling amendments on Monday. Does he agree with the Prime Minister when he said this morning there's no point in producing a system that the press won't take part in? And can the First Minister tell me how the Scottish Government intends to respond to the Prime Minister's developments?
First Minister.
Well, I saw the developments just before I came into the Chamber, and I was disappointed because the indications we were having yesterday was that the all-party talks had a positive air to them. As Willie Rennie knows, we are engaged in all-party talks and discussions ourselves. We have a further meeting this afternoon with the press themselves, and I think we'll be able to take account of recent developments and try and find a joint way forward. I think it would be hugely to be welcomed if we could find a joint way forward in this Parliament, or even if we can find if not absolute agreement on everything, then a consensus on some of the main planks of what needs to be done. And I'll certainly pursue things in that spirit, and I know Willie Rennie will as well.
Willie Rennie?
Yes, he's right. We will work constructively. And I'm disappointed too by the Prime Minister's actions this morning. The First Minister's expert group is currently considering how Scotland should implement Levison. Can he tell me whether there's any prospect that he can bring forward the report of that group so that it can influence the decisions that might be made in Westminster next week?
First Minister.
Well, the report The report is due to publish by the end of this month, and perhaps, in fairness to everybody else that talks, I'll be able to update Willie Rennie on that at the meeting this afternoon. But I think you'll find that the work of the expert group is well advanced.
Question 4, Bob Doris.
To ask the First Minister how the Scottish Government seeks to ensure that all relevant medical information is available to support patients who appeal to the Disability Benefits Tribunal system.
First Minister.
Well, the Scottish Government will do everything we can to facilitate a better outcome for people affected by this aspect of the UK Government's flawed welfare reforms. The simple fact is the UK Government's work capability assessment is flawed and has not been improved despite no fewer than 3 reviews thus far of its operation. This is evidenced by the fact that no fewer than 37%, I'll just repeat that figure, 37% of disability benefit rejections are then overturned on appeal.
Bob Doris.
I thank the First Minister for the answer. There are concerns over how and when the DWP and ATOS both request and use information provided by GPs in relation to work capability assessments and, as a result, the need for tribunals for constituents who are wrongly assessed by ATOS in the first place. Significant concerns also exist that additional pressures are also being placed on GPs in relation to sharing information due to the shameful and unjustifiable bedroom tax. Will the First Minister support my call for the DWP and ATOS to urgently review this flawed process to ensure medical information is requested from GPs on a consistent basis and, more importantly, also used appropriately in order to assist my constituents get the support they need from a deeply flawed UK benefits system?
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree with the question. I should point out that a very important piece of information sent to the Chancellor of the Exchequer as part of the Scottish Government's barrage of information to the UK Government to persuade them to change their minds on the bedroom tax, which I agree is iniquitous, is the submission made by the Finance Secretary to the Chancellor of the Exchequer on work carried out by Scottish Government economists, which show that the bedroom tax, as well as being socially iniquitous, as well as causing enormous disruption to families, actually in economic terms, in simple economic terms, is going to reduce economic output over the medium term. So even arguing it as the UK Government has done in terms of simple financial calculation is wrong according to that analysis. And so we're hoping for further and this time substantial concessions from the UK Government as they realise and should recognise the amount of social damage the bedroom tax is going to inflict.
Question 5, Lewis MacDonald.
The First Minister, what steps the Scottish Government is taking to tackle contraband in prisons?
First Minister.
Well, the Government and the Prison Service, of course, are committed to the prevention and detection of contraband coming into our prisons. We have invested in body scanners for each prison. We've doubled the number of prison detection dogs in the last 12 months. We've rolled out the Prison Watch scheme, which helps in particular to combat drugs being thrown over prison walls. I'm pleased that as a result we've been able to intercept more drugs other than otherwise would have been destined for our prisons. Fines have increased by 14% since 2011-12. Together with the £120 million a year investment in building modern prisons, this means that levels of security are higher than ever, but this remains a serious problem.
The First Minister will have seen in the Daily Record and elsewhere how smuggled phones are used to boast about smuggled drugs and to intimidate victims and witnesses on social networking sites. Does he agree with the prison officer who wrote to me the other day calling for phone blocking technology to be used in Scottish prisons? And given that Westminster is now passing a bill to allow that, will he undertake today to use those new powers to protect victims, witnesses and prison staff from the consequences of prisoners illegally using mobile phones?
I'll look carefully at what Lewis MacDonald has to say, but you should remember we changed the law in 2010 to allow for the prosecution of those who either introduce mobile phones into prison or have in their possession a mobile phone. That's resulted in 47 convictions of prisoners in 2011 alone. In 2012, there have been 110 convictions for the illegal possession of mobile phones in prisons. And I'll make these figures available to Lewis MacDonald because they indicate the stepping up of the attempt to drive drugs from the prison estate. I can also make available statistics which indicate that although the position is still serious, there is no doubt by the examination of prisoners when they leave prison that the methods and the measures that have been taken have resulted in a decline of what is a serious problem. But I think from these prosecution statistics, you can see that the 2010 changes in legislation are being rigorously enforced. The one aspect I didn't agree with in some of the press coverage is to look at the increase in drug fines as if they are a bad thing, that they are part of the problem. Actually, the increase in drug fines, of course, are directly related to the measures that I outlined. It's because of the increased security measures that we are finding more of these harmful substances in the prison estate.
Question 6, Stuart Stevenson.
To ask the First Minister what actions the Scottish Government will take to assist growth in the business sector.
First Minister.
Well, the Scottish Government is supporting and will continue to support business growth, innovation to the full extent of our current powers. Support for schools, colleges, universities and skills provides business with a skilled workforce and world-class research. A total of £564 million of relief has been awarded to Scottish businesses since the introduction of a small business bonus scheme, something which I believe has been a lifeline for many of our small businesses across Scotland.
Stuart Stevenson.
Has the First Minister noted the contrast between the growing optimism expressed through this week's Purchasing Managers Index and international sentiment which led to the downgrading of the UK's credit rating? And can he indicate what this and the recent JERS report may have to tell us about future prospects for Scotland now and after independence?
First Minister.
Well, I think we can confidently assume that the initials 3A will never be used by the Bitter Together campaign for some substantial time to come. Yes, the Purchase Managers Index is a helpful and welcome sign of economic recovery in Scotland, but let's be serious. There are still serious problems across the economy, and that's why it is so important that next week focuses the mind and attention of the Chancellor of the Exchequer in following the consistent advice not just from this Government but from the Welsh Administration and the Northern Irish Administration to bring the investment, particularly capital investment, that this economy so badly needs to bring us out of the present economic conditions. And now that one bit of the Tory Liberal coalition are, well, I was going to be nasty, but I won't. Some sinners repenteth. It's what we have to say to the calls for increased capital investment have been made by members of the coalition. Just let's hope that they can carry their Tory members with them in terms of the budget next week, and let's look for serious investment to get out of economic recession.